John Jacob Astor arrived in America with nothing but ambition. Yet within decades, he would become the richest man in the young republic, a billionaire by today's standards, and the first example of how crime and capitalism blended seamlessly on American soil. Born in 1763 in Waldorf, Germany, Astor came to New York in 1784, a city still scarred by the Revolutionary War. At first, he worked with furs, building ties with trappers and native tribes, exporting pelts to Europe and Asia. But fur was only the beginning, the stepping stone toward something far darker and more profitable. By the early 1800s, global demand for opium was skyrocketing. In China, millions were addicted, and Western merchants saw the empire's weakness as a golden opportunity. Officially, the trade was banned, but loopholes, bribery, and sheer greed made it flourish. Astor, watching from across the ocean, understood better than most that fortunes were not built on morality, they were built on monopoly and manipulation. He invested heavily in Turkish opium, shipping it under disguised manifests, using intermediaries to funnel it into Canton and other Chinese ports. Each voyage carried not only the stench of narcotics, but the scent of future skyscrapers, banks, and empires in America. His fortune swelled. Astor was no street hustler, no gangster with a gun. He was colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. He weaponized paperwork, maritime routes, and diplomacy. Where others risked prison, Astor wrapped himself in legitimacy. He used fronts, partnerships, and respected trading houses, so that if any shipment was caught, his name stayed in the shadows. By the time Chinese officials tried to crack down, his ships had already turned illicit powder into gold. The profits were obscene. Every chest of opium represented the ruin of countless lives abroad. But for Astor, it was the foundation of his American dream. With his wealth, he moved quickly to real estate, buying large swathes of Manhattan while it was still farmland and muddy streets. He understood what few others did. New York would grow, and land was the only resource that multiplied without labor. Dirty money became clean stone buildings. Opium-funded transactions turned into respectable deeds. Astor's name rose as a symbol of American ambition, while the corpses of Chinese addicts piled unseen on the other side of the world. By 1800, he was among the leading traders in America. By 1810, his reach extended to London, Canton, and every major port that mattered. The War of 1812 even benefited him. While others lost fortunes, Astor maneuvered carefully, using his networks to protect his assets. He founded the American Fur Company, which dominated the North American fur trade. But that was the mask, the respectable face shown to newspapers and politicians. Behind the mask, opium profits had already secured his throne. Politicians welcomed him. Society praised him. Newspapers printed his generosity. But in hushed tones, his rivals admitted the truth. John Jacob Astor had played dirtier and smarter than anyone else. The transformation of his wealth into real estate is what immortalized him. By the 1820s, Astor was buying prime locations in Manhattan. He invested not in wooden structures, but in land itself, knowing that tenants would come, buildings would rise, and rent would never stop. This was generational wealth, the kind that made a family dynasty untouchable. With each transaction, the origins of his wealth were buried deeper. By the time he died in 1848, Astor was worth an estimated $20 million, equal to billions today. It was the largest fortune in America, built not on innovation, not on invention, but on exploiting addiction across the ocean. Astor's story reveals the hypocrisy of America's gilded narrative. He was celebrated as a pioneer, a philanthropist, the man who donated to libraries and schools. His name became attached to respectability, to Astoria hotels, to districts and towns. Yet the truth was never erased. He had been one of the first drug kingpins of the Western world. He simply played at a scale too big to be punished. No court dared drag him in. No official dared challenge him, for his money had already seeped into politics, banks, and the very foundations of American society. The human cost of his fortune was catastrophic. China would later plunge into the Opium Wars, a conflict fueled by the very trade Astor and men like him pioneered. An entire civilization was destabilized, millions suffered, and dynasties collapsed. But in America, his descendants walked streets paved with wealth. They built mansions, funded institutions, entered elite circles, and carried a name free of scandal. The dirty truth stayed buried in trade logs and whispers. America wanted heroes of capital, not stories of blood-soaked profits. Astor's rise set a precedent. He proved that with enough money, crime could be laundered into respectability. He showed that empires built on vice could transform into legacies celebrated by society. Every American tycoon who followed, from bootleggers to gamblers to bankers laundering cartel cash, traced a path Astor had already cleared. He was the blueprint. The myth of the self-made man, the immigrant who became a titan, was sold to the public. But behind the myth was the brutal reality. Addiction financed America's first billionaire. When his will was read, it revealed the cold logic of his life. The majority of his estate went into the Astor Library, which would later merge into the New York Public Library System. The man who once smuggled poison into China became, in history's official memory, a patron of knowledge. The irony is staggering. Generations of students, writers, and thinkers would learn under the shadow of shelves built with opium money. The Astor family name would be carried forward in politics, society, and business, rarely with mention of its bloody foundation. This silence was not accidental. It was power in its purest form. Astor's legacy is not just a personal tale. It is a revelation of how America itself was shaped. The Republic celebrated liberty and honesty, but its wealthiest son was proof that crime and capital were partners from the beginning. The Astor Empire grew from fur and opium, but its echoes still ring in Wall Street towers and luxury hotels carrying his name. This is the hidden DNA of American wealth empires, of shadow dressed in the clothes of respectability. John Jacob Astor did not just become rich, he became untouchable. He proved that in America, if the crime was big enough, it was no longer a crime. It was business. Arnold Rothstein was not born into money, but he was born with something more dangerous, an instinct for risk and calculation that would turn him into one of the most powerful and feared figures of early 20th century America. Known later as the Brain, Rothstein understood before anyone else that gambling was not about chance, it was about control. He didn't just bet on games, he bought them. He didn't just enter casinos, he owned the men who ran them. And in doing so, he carved a criminal empire that made him the first true American crime financier, a man who connected Wall Street to the underworld with a single handshake. Born in 1882 into a wealthy Jewish family in New York, Rothstein grew up around comfort, but he never cared for the straight life. By his teenage years, he was already obsessed with cards, dice, and the mechanics of odds. Unlike the street gamblers around him, Arnold calculated every move. He studied probabilities, manipulated outcomes, and paid off referees, bookies, and even cops. By his early 20s, he was running high-stakes games that attracted not just hustlers, but bankers, politicians, and actors. He dressed immaculately, spoke calmly, and always carried himself like a businessman, not a gangster. That image became his greatest weapon. The moment that made Rothstein immortal came in 1919 with the Black Sox scandal. The Chicago White Sox were heavy favorites to win the World Series, But whispers circulated in the gambling world that the players were vulnerable. They weren't paid well, they were resentful, and Rothstein saw the crack in the system. Using intermediaries, he allegedly financed a scheme to bribe 8 White Sox players to deliberately throw the series against the Cincinnati Reds. The cost? About $100,000. The potential winnings? Millions. Though Rothstein never appeared personally in negotiations, his fingerprints were all over the fix. When the Sox lost in shocking fashion, baseball was rocked to its core. Fans screamed betrayal, newspapers exploded with scandal, and the players were eventually banned for life. But Rothstein? He walked away untouched. He denied involvement, smiled for the press, and told friends, "I only bet on sure things." This was the genius of Rothstein. He never needed to swing a bat or shoot a gun. His weapon was money, and his shield was respectability. He moved freely between boardrooms and back rooms, speaking the language of both. Politicians courted him, police chiefs owed him, and gangsters feared him. He financed speakeasies during Prohibition, invested in horse racing, controlled bookmaking operations across New York, and became the silent partner behind many of the era's most notorious gangsters, including Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Without Rothstein's money and mentorship, the modern American mafia might never have taken shape. Rothstein's reach extended far beyond gambling. He understood Prohibition as a gold mine before the first bottles were banned. When alcohol went underground, he was ready. His network smuggled liquor from Canada and Europe, distributed it through speakeasies, and reinvested profits into more legitimate fronts. To the outside world, he appeared as a polished businessman with investments in real estate and shipping. But insiders knew. Rothstein was the banker of the underworld. He didn't just run crime, he financed it, streamlined it, and turned it into an industry. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to act invisible. He avoided the flamboyant violence of other criminals. While men like Al Capone drew headlines with machine guns and bloodshed, Rothstein worked quietly in the background, pulling strings, funding wars, and cashing in on every outcome. He turned the chaos of crime into something resembling corporate structure. He even established a kind of mentorship program for younger mobsters. Lucky Luciano once said, "Arnold Rothstein taught me how to dress, how to use knives and forks, and how to deal with the police and politicians." Arnold Rothstein was the man who taught the whole underworld how to live. But every empire has cracks, and Rothstein's downfall came from the very world he mastered. In 1928, he entered a high-stakes poker game at New York's Park Central Hotel. For 2 days straight, cards were dealt, money piled, and accusations flew. Rothstein lost heavily, nearly $320,000, but refused to pay, claiming the game was fixed against him. It was the ultimate irony. The man who fixed baseball now accusing others of rigging a game. Weeks later, on November 4th, 1928, Rothstein was shot in the gut at the hotel. Mortally wounded, he refused to name his killer. He clung to the criminal code of silence until the end. "You stick to your friends," he whispered. He died 2 days later, aged just 46. The world reacted with shock. Newspapers screamed headlines about "the brain brought down." Gangsters whispered that his death signaled the end of an era. His funeral was massive, attended by politicians, businessmen, and mobsters alike. In death, as in life, Rothstein blurred the line between respectability and crime. He left behind no empire in his name, but his influence lived on in every mob boss who followed. His protégés Luciano, Lansky, Bugsy Siegel carried his lessons into the next generation, building syndicates that would dominate America for decades. What makes Rothstein's story so powerful is not just the scandal of the 1919 World Series, but what it revealed about America itself. A national pastime, a symbol of innocence, was corrupted at its core by money. And the man behind it didn't wear a mask or carry a gun. He wore tailored suits and held banknotes. He proved that with enough cash, even America's sacred games could be bought and sold. Baseball recovered, but it never forgot. The myth of purity was shattered forever. In the broader history of American wealth, Rothstein occupies a special place. He wasn't the richest. He didn't leave behind skyscrapers or libraries like Astor. But he pioneered something just as powerful. The idea that crime could be structured like business, that gangsters could be gentlemen, that fortunes could be made not through brute force, but through calculation, bribery, and strategy. He was the bridge between the old underworld of thugs and the modern era of organized crime. His story echoes in Wall Street scandals, corporate frauds, and every rigged system where the house always wins. Arnold Rothstein was more than a gambler. He was the man who bought baseball, the man who taught the Mafia how to think, and the man who proved that America itself was a casino, one where the richest players didn't gamble. They owned the game. Meyer Lansky was never the loudest man in the room, never the kind to wave guns or spray bullets in the streets, yet he became one of the most powerful figures the American underworld ever produced. Small in stature, quiet in voice, and almost invisible compared to the flamboyant gangsters of his era, Lansky built his empire not with violence, but with numbers. He was the accountant of crime, the financial genius who laundered dirty fortunes and transformed the Mafia into a global business network. While Al Capone rotted in prison for tax evasion, Lansky showed that brains would always outlast brute force. Born in 1902 in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, Lansky's family fled pogroms and poverty, arriving in New York when Meyer was still a child. Like countless immigrants, they settled on the Lower East Side, a neighborhood thick with hunger, hustlers, and opportunity. It was here that Lansky met Benjamin Siegel, later known as Bugsy, and the two became inseparable. Where Siegel had charm and violence, Lansky had calculation. Together, they began running small gambling rackets, dice games, and protection schemes. But Meyer's mind always reached further. He saw gambling not as street crime, but as a potential empire. By the 1920s, Lansky was working with Arnold Rothstein, learning how big money moved, how politicians were bought, how police could be neutralized, and how casinos could be structured to guarantee endless profits. Rothstein became a mentor, and after his death, Lansky carried forward the lessons. Keep a low profile, stay calm, and never gamble unless the odds are fixed in your favor. With prohibition in full swing, Lansky and Siegel expanded into bootlegging, partnering with Italian mobsters like Lucky Luciano. The alliances they formed would later create the National Crime Syndicate, a nationwide network of organized crime families. But Lansky's true genius was in finance. While Luciano organized the structure and Siegel handled enforcement, Lansky made sure the money flowed smoothly. He developed laundering systems that moved profits through banks, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses. In the 1930s, while Capone was falling to the IRS, Lansky was building layers of financial shields. His operations funneled money through Swiss banks, using secrecy laws to protect mob fortunes. This was revolutionary. Instead of hiding cash under mattresses or burying it in backyards, Lansky turned mob money into investments, stocks, and international accounts. Crime became business. He also understood that gambling was the Mafia's cleanest face. Unlike drugs or extortion, gambling could be disguised as entertainment. Lansky invested in casinos across Florida, New Orleans, and later Havana, Cuba. In Havana, he struck deals with dictator Fulgencio Batista, pouring millions into luxury hotels and casinos. For a time, Havana was the mob's paradise. a glittering playground where Americans flew down to drink, gamble, and party under Lansky's rules. Profits soared. Every dollar that passed across the blackjack tables carried the fingerprints of Lansky's genius. In Las Vegas, Lansky's vision also shaped history. While Bugsy Siegel is often credited as the father of modern Vegas, it was Lansky's financial backing and organizational control that made it possible. He financed Siegel's Flamingo Hotel, though Siegel's reckless overspending and eventual murder showed the difference between them. Lansky thought like a banker, Siegel like a gambler. After Siegel's death, Lansky and his associates took tighter control of Vegas, turning it into a money machine that funneled mob profits for decades. What made Lansky nearly untouchable was his invisibility. He never flaunted wealth. He lived modestly compared to other mobsters, drove simple cars, wore plain suits, and kept out of the spotlight. This discipline frustrated law enforcement, who could never tie him directly to violent crimes. He avoided wiretaps, spoke in code, and always used intermediaries. While the FBI called him one of the most dangerous men in America, they could never pin a major conviction on him. He was arrested several times, but charges rarely stuck. During World War II, Lansky even cooperated with the U.S. government. Through Operation Underworld, the Navy secretly partnered with organized crime to secure New York docks against Nazi sabotage. Luciano, imprisoned at the time, offered his influence in exchange for leniency, and Lansky acted as intermediary. For his service, Luciano's sentence was reduced, showing again how Lansky could turn crime into patriotism when needed. Yet his empire was not without challenges. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Lansky's casinos in Havana were seized by Castro's new government. Overnight, he lost millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, and his dream of turning Cuba into a mafia kingdom vanished in smoke. Still, Lansky remained resilient, shifting focus back to Vegas, Miami, and offshore accounts. He always had reserves hidden where governments couldn't reach. By the 1970s, aging and pursued by investigators, Lansky tried to retire quietly. In 1972, he fled to Israel, invoking the law of return as a Jew seeking citizenship. For a time, it looked like he had escaped America's justice forever. But under U.S. pressure, Israel eventually denied his stay, and Lansky returned. Even then, prosecutors could never fully corner him. When he died in 1983 in Miami Beach at age 80, the government estimated his fortune at only a few $100,000. But everyone knew the truth. Billions had disappeared into offshore accounts, invisible, untouchable, eternal. Meyer Lansky left behind no skyscrapers, no corporations, no foundations with his name. His legacy was more hidden, yet far more influential. He proved that crime could operate like a multinational corporation, that money could erase borders, and that the pen could be deadlier than the gun. Every cartel, every modern laundering scheme, every offshore empire of shadow wealth follows the blueprint Lansky designed. Joseph Patrick Kennedy is remembered by history as the patriarch of America's most famous political dynasty, the father of a president, senators, and ambassadors. But behind the photographs of smiling children and elegant family portraits lies a truth that few dared to put in the headlines. Joseph Kennedy built the Kennedy fortune with shadows, bootlegging, smuggling, and deals with the underworld. His empire of wealth and influence was not born in Harvard classrooms or respectable boardrooms, but in back rooms filled with contraband liquor and whispered promises to gangsters. Born in Boston in 1880 to Irish immigrants, Joseph Kennedy was ambitious from the start. He wanted not only money, but acceptance into the elite Protestant society that looked down on Irish Catholics. He worked in banks, became the youngest bank president in America by his mid-20s, and invested in the booming stock market of the 1920s. But Kennedy was never satisfied with slow respectability. He craved shortcuts, and the Volstead Act, the law that enforced prohibition, gave him the perfect one. When America outlawed alcohol in 1920, a new black market worth billions was born overnight. Smugglers, gangsters, and businessmen rushed to fill the demand. Kennedy saw opportunity. Using his connections in shipping, finance, and politics, he became a major importer of liquor, working with Canadian distilleries and British companies to move alcohol across the border. The legend, whispered in political circles for decades, is that Kennedy partnered with mobsters like Frank Costello and even dealt with Chicago's infamous Al Capone to ensure his shipments arrived safely. Whether every rumor is true hardly matters. What matters is that Kennedy had liquor flowing while the rest of America was dry. The genius of Kennedy was not only in smuggling, but in timing. He anticipated the end of Prohibition. As the 1930s dragged on, public opinion shifted, and Franklin D. Roosevelt promised repeal. Kennedy positioned himself perfectly. He secured exclusive distribution rights from legitimate British distilleries, including Dewar's Scotch and Gordon's Gin, so that when Prohibition ended in 1933, Kennedy was no longer a criminal. He was one of the most powerful legal liquor distributors in America. What had been smuggling became business, and the fortune was already made. At the same time, Kennedy played the stock market with ruthless precision. He manipulated shares, engaged in insider trading, and exploited loopholes that were barely illegal in the freewheeling 1920s. He made millions before the Great Depression hit, and unlike many, he exited early, sensing the crash. He kept his fortune while others lost everything. Later, Roosevelt would ironically appoint Kennedy as the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the very body meant to police the kinds of manipulations Kennedy had mastered. To some, it was irony. To others, proof that Kennedy's real talent was turning crime into legitimacy. But liquor and stocks were not the whole story. Kennedy's rise was greased by relationships with organized crime. The underworld protected his shipments, moved his product, and in exchange, Kennedy invested and shielded them politically. His ties to Frank Costello, the mob's political boss, were particularly strong. Costello had influence in Tammany Hall, New York's political machine, and Kennedy's access to him meant Kennedy's business ran smoother than most. Later, critics would whisper that mob money helped finance Kennedy's children's political campaigns. Joseph Kennedy also understood publicity. He moved into Hollywood in the late 1920s, investing in movie studios and exploiting the industry's chaos. He manipulated contracts, seduced actresses, and turned films into profit engines. His Hollywood years cemented his reputation as both ruthless and charming, a man who could negotiate with Wall Street bankers in the morning and dine with gangsters in the evening. Everywhere he went, Kennedy built bridges, legitimate or not that, would serve his family's future. By the late 1930s, Kennedy was one of the wealthiest men in America. Roosevelt appointed him ambassador to the United Kingdom, a prestigious role that gave him international stature. But behind the ambassador's title was a man whose fortune still carried the scent of bootleg whiskey and mob-protected shipments. His critics never forgot. Whispers of the bootlegger ambassador followed him, though they were rarely said aloud in public. The Kennedy dynasty was born from this fortune. John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy all rose on the shoulders of Joseph's money and connections. Campaigns cost millions, and Kennedy paid. Political favors required influence, and Kennedy had it. The family projected an image of idealism, youth, and purity, but the empire that funded it was rooted in Prohibition's shadows. Even as President John F. Kennedy stood before the nation promising hope and freedom, his family's name carried debts to men in smoke-filled rooms. Joseph Kennedy himself was unapologetic. He believed that in America, only results mattered. "It's not what you are, it's what people think you are," he famously said. a philosophy that summed up his entire life. He was willing to be hated privately as long as the public image shone brightly. Behind closed doors, he admitted to associates that crime had paved his family's way into the elite. In public, he smiled and played the role of the respectable patriarch. The irony of Kennedy's life is staggering. He built wealth through bootlegging and market manipulation, yet ended his career as a respected statesman. He consorted with mobsters, but raised sons who became crusaders against organized crime. He embodied the American paradox, the blending of corruption and legitimacy, shadow and light, crime and dynasty. When he died in 1969, Joseph Kennedy was remembered not for the liquor shipments that had crossed borders in the night, not for the secret deals with gangsters, but as the father of a president cut down in Dallas and a senator gunned down in Los Angeles. The Kennedy family's tragedy overshadowed its origins. History books call him a businessman, a banker, an ambassador, but the streets remember him differently. He was the bootlegger who bought his way into the American aristocracy. The Kennedy fortune stands as proof that in America, wealth cleanses all sins. What began with smuggling whiskey became a political dynasty. What started in shadows ended in monuments. Joseph Kennedy taught his children that power was the ultimate prize and that morality was negotiable. His dynasty still carries his name, but his true legacy is a lesson as old as America itself. Fortunes built on crime can, with enough polish and patience, become the foundation of respectability, even greatness. The stories of Astor, Rothstein, Lansky, and Kennedy feel like history, legends of another era. But the truth is simple. Nothing has changed. The shadows that built America's first billionaires still breathe today, only wearing different clothes. The gangsters traded their fedoras for Armani suits, their smuggling routes for encrypted servers, their briefcases of cash for digital wallets of cryptocurrency. The methods evolved, but the formula remained the same. Crime feeds fortune, fortune buys legitimacy, and legitimacy erases the crime. Modern America is still ruled by men who understand that money is power, and power can make any sin invisible. The Mexican and Colombian cartels are the clearest example. Their rivers of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl generate hundreds of billions annually, and much of that money flows north into the United States. But the modern cartel boss does not hoard stacks of cash in jungles. He invests in Miami real estate, New York hedge funds, and Los Angeles tech startups. Entire neighborhoods of luxury condos stand as monuments to laundered narco dollars. Prices soar, locals are pushed out, and the profits of addiction are transformed into glass towers overlooking the ocean. Federal investigations occasionally uncover a single shell company, a suspicious transfer, but by then the money has already traveled through 5 banks, 3 continents, and a dozen front companies. Wall Street itself has become a partner in shadow wealth. The 2008 financial crisis revealed that major banks, from HSBC to Wachovia, had laundered billions for drug cartels. HSBC was caught moving hundreds of millions in narco dollars, money traced back to Sinaloa cartel operations that left thousands dead. The penalty? A fine. No executives jailed, no empire dismantled. The message was clear. When the crime is big enough, it becomes business. Just as Astor proved with opium 2 centuries earlier, the blood of addicts can be alchemized into respectable wealth, as long as the numbers are written in the right columns. Cryptocurrency added a new dimension. Bitcoin was born as a libertarian experiment, but it quickly became the laundering tool of choice for the 21st century underworld. Darknet markets like Silk Road allowed billions in illegal transactions, drugs, weapons, stolen data, while blockchain anonymity protected the players. Early adopters, many of them criminals, became accidental billionaires as Bitcoin prices soared. The irony was brutal. Hackers, drug dealers, and scammers who had once been chased by law enforcement now invested their crypto gains into legitimate businesses, startups, and luxury real estate. Some even became philanthropists, giving TED Talks and sitting on panels about the future of finance, while their fortunes were still rooted in theft and vice. American corporations are not innocent. Luxury car dealerships, jewelry stores, private equity firms, and real estate developers all benefit from dirty money seeking a clean home. For every cartel boss or crypto king, there is a respectable CEO smiling in a boardroom, accepting checks that no one dares to question. This is Meyer Lansky's vision updated. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, trusts in Delaware, shell companies in Panama. Global finance is the perfect laundromat, and the dirtiest fortunes are often the most carefully pressed. Even politics is not immune. Campaign donations, super PACs, and lobbying are the modern equivalents of mob payoffs. Billionaires with questionable origins use their wealth to shape laws, protect loopholes, and shield themselves from scrutiny. The Kennedy dynasty was born from bootlegging. Today's dynasties are born from hedge funds that launder cartel cash or venture capital firms seeded with crypto profits. The names change, but the DNA is the same. America still crowns kings whose thrones are built on shadows. Consider the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family, legally flooded America with OxyContin, a prescription painkiller that created millions of addicts. The result was hundreds of thousands of deaths, destroyed families, and an epidemic that rivaled the devastation of heroin in the 1970s. Yet the Sacklers became billionaires, their names etched on museum wings and universities. When lawsuits came, they negotiated settlements, shielded much of their fortune, and walked away free. Compare that to a street dealer caught with a handful of pills. He faces decades in prison. The Sacklers dined with presidents. Crime, once again, became respectability when wrapped in corporate paperwork. The modern underworld is no longer limited to mobsters in smoky bars. It is tech moguls who manipulate data and sell user privacy to the highest bidder. It is hedge fund managers who use insider information and fraudulent schemes to strip billions from pensions and investments. It is defense contractors who profit from endless wars, oil companies who bribe foreign governments, and billionaires who hide their wealth while their workers live on scraps. The suits are sharper, the language cleaner, but the principle is unchanged. Power built on exploitation. And yet, like Astor's libraries, Kennedy's foundations, and Lansky's hospitals, modern billionaires polish their legacies with charity. They donate to universities, fund museums, build research centers. Their names shine in gold letters above doors of culture and education, while the origins of their money remain hidden. The world sees philanthropists, history whispers criminals. The cycle continues. Just as the opium trade built America's first dynasty, just as gambling and bootlegging built its 20th century titans, so too will crypto, cartels, and corporate fraud build the billionaires of tomorrow. Young men studying finance or coding in Silicon Valley may unknowingly partner with laundered money. Real estate agents may sell condos built on drug profits. Politicians may accept campaign funds born in blood. The shadows are everywhere, yet invisible, because they wear the mask of legitimacy. The lesson is clear. America's wealthiest men and women are not always innovators or geniuses. They are often opportunists who knew when to break the law, when to bend it, and when to buy enough power to erase their sins. Astor smuggled opium, Rothstein bought baseball, Lansky banked the mob, Kennedy smuggled liquor, and today's billionaires manipulate algorithms, launder cartel money, or sell addiction in the form of pills. The crime changes its face, but the story remains the same. In the end, history may write their names in textbooks, their families may inherit dynasties, and their foundations may shine in marble. But beneath it all, the truth is permanent. The foundation of American wealth has always been crime dressed as business. The richest men of yesterday and today share one secret. They knew that in America, fortune favors not the honest, but the bold, the ruthless, and the invisible. He was called the mob's accountant, but that title undersells his true role. He was the architect of organized crime's financial empire, the man who turned gangsters into businessmen, the silent force behind decades of fortune and corruption. In a world obsessed with loud power, Meyer Lansky showed that the quietest man in the room could be the most dangerous.